Hi, I'm Mzansi. You're listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. I am your host, Patricia Tembo, and welcome to episode 533. We've spoken about agroecology before on the podcast, but today we're going to look at how farmers can tap into niche markets and improve their economic viability by implementing agroecological practices on their farms. So, of course, this episode is set to be both informative and practical as we welcome Joseph Karoo, who is an agricultural economist at the Agricultural Research Council. Joseph Karoo, welcome to Food for Mzansi's podcast, Farmers Inside Track.
Thank you, Patricia. It's quite a privilege and an honor for me to be participating in your interview.
Thank you, Mr. Karoo. And you are a very experienced agricultural economist at the Agricultural Research Council, as you've mentioned. But for our listeners who haven't heard of you, could you expand on the work that you are doing in the agricultural sector?
For the sake of listeners and audience, my name is Joseph Karoo, an agricultural economist with the Agricultural Research Council of South Africa. I'm glad to empower farmers with knowledge relating to agroecology.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Mr. Karoo, for some of our listeners who haven't heard of you at all and the work that you are doing through the Agricultural Research Council, maybe expand a little bit more on your involvement in the sector.
I must explain the domain of agricultural economics is quite broad. So basically what I do in the Agricultural Research Council, I'm responsible for doing economic impact studies, for doing economic viability studies, responsible for doing policy analysis, and we are involved in various aspects relating to rural development and agricultural development, if I may summarize it that way.
That's really broad, as you said, the work that you're involved in. And I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about it as we dive into the topic that we have today. So, Mr. Karoo, for our listeners who aren't familiar with the term and framework of agroecology, could you please expand on it and maybe adding the South African context to this framework?
I'll provide a scientific definition of agroecology, and most of the conceptualization of agroecology emanates from the work of a number of organizations that are affiliated with the United Nations. One of those organizations is the Food Agriculture Organization, and according to their definition, agroecology is an integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concepts and principles to the design and management of food and agricultural system. It is based on the application of ecological concepts and principles to optimize interactions between plants, animals, humans, and the environment while taking into consideration the social aspects that needs to be addressed from a sustainable and fair food systems. So if I may break it down for you, for some time now, we've been talking about management of ecosystem, and there's been a number of interventions that were there to deal with management of ecosystem. And in the agricultural field, some of the interventions, I'll mention a few, included things like conservation agriculture. The other one could be organic farming. The other one could be regenerative farming. So all those concepts basically were focusing on the issue of having to preserve the environment, to preserve plants, to also preserve animals. So this time around, with regard to agroecology, we are now also incorporating the social welfare needs of humans. We are also incorporating the livelihood strategies of humans. And more importantly, the issue of health of humans is paramount so far as agroecology is concerned. So it's a holistic approach of trying to balance the whole ecosystem with humans becoming an integral part of the ecosystem. And as South Africans, we are privileged because a few years back, I think 10 years back, we were fortunate to actually secure a geographic indicator for one of the commodities that were produced under agroecological conditions. And those commodities include the rooibos tea, and the Karoo lamb. So, the geographic indicator simply speaks about the intellectual property of a product that is produced under organic farming, a product where synthetic fertilizers are not used in the production system, a product where chemicals are not used in the production system, a product where in the process, indigenous people are actually respected and are being made an integral part of the farming system to an extent that their indigenous knowledge system is actually valued, and those local indigenous people are being compensated for the indigenous knowledge system that they shared in the process of producing that particular product. Also to mention that the geographic indicator seeks to appreciate and acknowledge the area of origin of that particular product. Like giving an example of both the rooibos and the Karoo lamb. Both of them, they originate from the Northern Cape province of South Africa. And by securing that intellectual property in the form of geographic indicator, it means there is no other country elsewhere in the world that can produce rooibos and use that name as if that name originated from that country. So we hold a very unique intellectual property that relates to South Africa and specifically relates to the Northern Cape. And as a result, when rooibos and Karoo lamb are actually traded in overseas market, we are able to secure a premium price. So in essence, we are being compensated and we are being rewarded for producing a particular agricultural product under sustainable agricultural practices, while in the process, we also respect the welfare needs of the farmers involved in the production system.
I'd just like to take a few steps back with the definition of agroecology that you gave. You answered what would have been my follow-up question, and that was how it differs from other methods that have been identified. And, you've mentioned those as intervention methods, and that is conservation agriculture, organic farming, and the regenerative agriculture. However, the social aspect, I think, is something that we can maybe speak about a bit more on what that exactly means. I know there's a lot of studies that are being done on the social aspect of agroecology in South America, countries like Brazil. But bringing it back home here to South Africa, how does agroecology address the specific social needs of the farmers?
You must have realized that in South Africa, to a larger extent, the type of agriculture that we practice is conventional agriculture. Now, with conventional agriculture, most of the food products that we produce are of exotic origin. So most of the products that we produce, they originate from the West. Whereas our local indigenous food products are neglected and marginalized. So over time, it has come to our attention to realize that the type of agriculture, which is conventional agriculture that we are practicing, is actually harmful to the environment. Because now with conventional agriculture, you use fertilizer, you use chemicals, you use a lot of fossil fuel, you use a significant amount of equipment and machinery. And in the process, what happens is that we release a lot of greenhouse gases, your CO2 emissions, and that is harmful to the environment. So even if as society we were to choose to be ignorant, unfortunately, the negative effects of climate change has actually put us at the corner, where now we realize going into the future, we don't have a choice, but we really need to reflect on the type of agriculture that we practice. And hence, we sort of started to reconsider our methods, and it was established that agroecology could be the most sustainable and viable way of farming going into the future. So coming back to our specific questions around issues of social, we really need to actually acknowledge the fact that most of the indigenous crop species that our people are familiar to, those crop commodities are adaptable to the environment. That's number one. They don't need a lot of synthetic inputs. They don't need a lot of chemical inputs. And more importantly, some scientific studies have been conducted whereby it has been established that most of these indigenous crop species, they actually carry more nutrients as opposed to exotic food commodities that originate from the West. I also need to mention the fact that we have had a situation where a number of indigenous food products, their IP has been misappropriated to an extent that local people will be willing to share information relating to some of the indigenous food products. I can give an example of Amaheu, the example of Amarula drink. There are quite a number of them. The example of Bildo. But along the process, you find that those food products are actually appropriated by multinational companies. And when that happens, the local people are not compensated for their own knowledge. They are not even made integral shareholders in the new venture. So at the end of the day, the people who manufacture those indigenous products and process them, they end up owning the intellectual property, whereas our local people are being sidelined. So with regard to agroecology, the principles are those of saying we really need to respect indigenous knowledge system of our local people. So that's why some of the principles within agroecology speaks about co-creation of knowledge. They talk about social justice and they talk about natural resource governance. Those are the social principles that are actually making sure that our local people are made an integral part of the management of agricultural development, if I may put it that way, Patricia.
Well put. And I'm just thinking of our farmers, most of them are introduced to conventional agriculture. How does this shift, or how would you see farmers moving from a conventional agriculture, that approach, to agroecological approach?
It is not an easy process because now we are actually trying to move people from conventional agriculture to agroecological practices. And the problem is that our farmers are profit-driven. Most of the time, they are after profit. You know, with conventional agriculture, one of the main focal points has got to do with high yield. And high yield happens to be associated with genetically modified organisms. And the genetically modified organisms are an integral part of conventional agriculture. So with agroecology, the benefits are in the long run. So you seek to derive benefits after a long time, but more importantly, most of the critical benefit is the build of organic matter in your soil. So in other words, sustainably so, we are building your soil in a manner that it will be regenerative going into the future. Whereas with conventional agriculture, the amount of fertilizer that you put to your soil, it tends to lower the quality of soil with time. So at the beginning, you will be realizing a lot of yield, but some 100 years down the line, your soil is no longer capable of producing the very same amount of yield because the quality is going down. Whereas with agroecology, you are building the biomass, you are building the organic matter, and going into the future, your soil remains productive, and in the future, you will be able to reap the same amount of profits. So it's through processes like this where now we come to a platform and we communicate the benefits of agroecology and we educate people about some of the social aspects that relates to them sharing some of the proceeds of sharing knowledge in the space of indigenous knowledge system. So basically, I think it will take a lot of awareness campaign to bring about a paradigm shift in the manner by which people perceive agriculture.
So when looking at the agroecological framework, is there assurance that a farmer who is considering to shift their practices from a conventional to an agroecological practices, is the assurance that they can still meet the profit that they want in their business?
So one of the most critical principles in the practice of agroecology is the issue of economic diversification, and the other one is biodiversity. So if farmers were to perceive agroecology with an open mind, there is actually a niche market which farmers can exploit. You can imagine most of the commodities that are marketed in your mainstream supermarkets, in your mainstream retail shops, most of them, they are exotic products of Western origin. There are quite a number of African people who would love to go to those supermarkets and be able to buy their own products they can relate to be able to buy indigenous products such as your moroho, African leafy vegetables, a number of indigenous fruit products. And because of that, if farmers were to embrace agroecology and adopt it, now they will be able to bring a new set of new indigenous products where there's no competition. In other words, they will have a niche market which is not concentrated by large-scale commercial farmers. And by bringing niche products, it means now they've got control on price, they've got competitive edge over other farmers. So that in itself serves as an advantage. So there are opportunities for farmers to exploit. And also going back to the initial example I gave an example of rooibos and the Karoo lamb. Some of these products that they will be introducing into the market, with time, the government will be able to support them. And there are opportunities that some of the products could also secure a geographic indicator. And when that happens, it means that particular product, when you market in overseas markets, you are able to secure a premium price. And as you are aware, the prices that we fetch in international markets are actually expressed in dollars. So the currency is different from the one we have locally. And the moment you are able to sell in the currency of a dollar, then your profit will be higher. So there are opportunities for farmers to actually secure premium prices if all the relevant interventions are put in place and we actually embrace agroecology. The opportunities are actually many. It is upon us as policymakers to actually promote agroecology and make sure that farmers can see benefits coming out of agroecology.
One would imagine that, of course, a farmer wouldn't want to be farming at a loss. So it is encouraging, I think, to hear. Going into the meat, I suppose, of this conversation, the agroecology itself, it's founded on 13 principles. Could you walk us through those principles, giving us examples of what that looks like locally, as the case study that you shared of the rooibos farmers, and you also mentioned the Karoo lamb, maybe using those as an example, just for the farmers who are listening. Agroecology is not some far-fetched framework, that it is quite applicable within their context as well.
Before getting into the 13 principles, I need to mention that agroecology is not a new concept. Historically, our people has been practicing agroecology in default. Come to think about it, most of the African farmers back in history, they used to practice what we call integrated farming systems. So you will have a farmer producing crops, and at the same time, the farmer will be rearing animals. He will be keeping cattle, chickens, goats, sheep, and also and pigs. And what will happen is that the farmer will use the waste product from animals, your manure, and use it as a fertilizer to fertilize the crops. And back in the years, the farmers used to practice broadcasting, they used to practice crop rotation, they used to practice intercropping. That system in its own right had a way of recycling material within the farming system and had a way of actually enhancing the organic matter of the soil. The only difference is that back in the days, that system was not referred to as agroecology. But when you look into it, you can really appreciate that indeed it was agroecology. So now I will explain in those 18 principles. One of the important principles within agroecology is recycling. And the other one is input reduction. The other one is soil health. The other one is animal health. We have biodiversity, economic diversification, co-creation of knowledge, social justice, natural resource governance, connectivity, participation, fairness, and dietary diversity. So some of the 5 critical ones, namely recycling, input reduction, and biodiversity. These principles, they are already practiced in the domain of conservation agriculture. It has been happening for some time now. So most of the farmers are familiar with these practices, especially those who does conservation agriculture. But the other principles, like, for instance, co-creation of knowledge, social justice, dietary diversity, and natural resource governance, and fairness and social justice, those are new principles that came about as a result of agroecology. And I had already alluded to the issue of social justice, whereby local people needs to be compensated for their indigenous knowledge system, whereby local people needs to be made an integral part of agricultural development. To a certain extent, even issues of land reform somehow get into the equation of agroecology, because for people to be able to produce, you need to have access to land. if you don't have access to land, you will not be able to produce. And in a way, also giving an example of rooibos again, the farmers, they have access to land and they are also involved, in the management and governance system of the whole enterprise. So it's not just a matter of being involved at the level of farming, being involved at the level of cultivation. When it comes to governance issues, when it comes to decision making, when it comes to marketing, decision making, when it comes to commercialization, local farmers are an integral part of that system. So basically, those 13 principles, they are sought to balance between environmental preservation and also preserving the social welfare needs of our local farmers.
It sounds like there are three main categories under agroecology, and the social aspect, as you've said, the ecological is very important. I think farmers are probably most informed or aware of the ecological practices, and then the economic considerations within agroecology. But, having those three factors working together, how do you see that in a South African context, looking at the social, ecological, and economic factors that are encompassed in agroecology? How do you balance those as a farmer?
I will go back to that example of the Karoo lamb and the rooibos tea, where these three principles has actually put into practice. So with particular to those examples, specifically the rooibos case study, the environmental preservation is actually being observed. In other words, using that example, in that particular project, the farmers are not using synthetic fertilizer. They are not using chemicals. And when it comes to issues of the social aspect of things, the rooibos is actually a product for which the indigenous knowledge system was that of the Khoisan people. And those are the very same people who are involved in the production system. So there is that embracing of local taste, there's that embracing of local food products, and there is that aspect of actually making sure that local people are being compensated for the product that actually belongs to them. So that is the social aspect of things. And in the process, there are issues relating to training and capacity building. So in the process, farmers are actually trained in relation to aspects of project management, issues relating to financial management, and other issues that are in the space of social empowerment. When it comes to the economic aspects, I have alluded to the issue of the premium price that is actually secured in export markets. That in itself is critical in ensuring that farmers are able to realize profit. Because at the end of the day, if you produce, but you are unable to realize profit, it means your project is going to collapse. So in essence, this is how the three dimensions, some people in the field of business, they refer to this as triple bottom line of sustainability. Your social, ecological, and economic principles working together. So in essence, that's how these three principles can be balanced.
The Highveld, the case that you shared, the Highveld organic rooibos sort in Nivellville, that is a success story of, agroecological practices. Could you maybe give us just a brief synopsis of how these farmers are doing it?
One thing I need to mention, the Karoo, and specifically the area in question, Nivellville, it's more like a marginal environment. So it's an area where you can't produce any other crop. The place is semi-arid, but somehow rooibos was adaptable to that area. As much as they are observing a number of agroecological principles, one principle that they are not able to observe is the one relating to maybe diversity, because not all products are adaptable to the area, but otherwise everything else relating to conservation agriculture is being observed in that area. But the question of how do they get it right has to do with the fact that the farmers actually, at some point, they had to sort of confront the system, which in the beginning, the system was not favoring local people, because at some point, their intellectual property was appropriated. And the Khoisan people in the area, they took the matter to court, arguing that they are supposed to be an integral part of everything that was happening with regard to rooibos. And at the end of the day, they won the case at court. And now that's how they were incorporated into the whole system of rooibos production And at the end of the day, they were empowered in terms of other three principles I mentioned, which has got to do with social, ecological, and economic principles. And across South Africa, there are a number of examples where farmers, especially our indigenous local farmers, they are not aware that they really need to protect their intellectual property. So it's a matter of awareness. It's a matter of policymakers and awareness among our farmers to make them aware that they can actually derive value out of, indigenous products that they know. If you were, for instance, to think about some of the products that are happening across South Africa, we do have, earlier alluded to amarula, we do have things like maheu. All those things are indigenous products. We have things like hodia tea, and some of the farmers are not aware that they can actually derive value from exploiting those natural resources. So somehow the Khoisan people, they have really assisted us in terms of confronting the situation and making sure that at the end of the day, they are made an integral part of agricultural development. So there are still a lot of opportunities out there that we can exploit as South Africans, if I may put it that way.
In your position, you of course have all the information when it comes to indigenous crops and the markets that are there. I'm thinking of our farmers listening who have been interested in cultivating indigenous crops. So if you can perhaps give a few examples of where a farmer can start with that or which crops to look at.
I need to mention that in a space of a month, the Agricultural Research Council will be hosting an agroecology farmer awareness day event. It will happen in Pretoria. This initiative, among other things, is specifically meant to educate farmers about agroecological practices and to also educate farmers about the indigenous food products. And also to mention, within the Agricultural Research Council, we do have the gene bank. So what happens with the gene bank is that we go across the country, we collect seed of indigenous commodities, and these seeds are stored in a gene bank. And we also are training farmers on the production of the African leafy vegetables. We are also teaching farmers about the sustainable production of indigenous medicinal plants. And also we do have the Department of Agriculture, which is also involved in several aspects relating to the promotion of indigenous crop species. Specifically, the Department of Agriculture has got a program whereby, and it is happening a lot in the Limpopo province, whereby farmers are mobilized and farmers are trained with regard to the production and multiplication of the seed for indigenous crop species. So a lot of things are happening. It's just that the farmers are not aware and the farmers, they do not have information. So in a way, an interview of this nature will provide critical information such that farmers can become aware and start to exploit these opportunities. And some of the farmers, by the way, are already practicing agroecology. So we'll also provide an opportunity for farmers to come and showcase some of the work that they do in the space of agroecology. We are available for our farmers at any point in time. They can contact us. And also to mention, it's not only about production. In the space of agroecology, there are opportunities for agro-processing and value addition. And all those elements, they can access in the Agricultural Research Council. We do have a unit that is specializing with agro-processing and value addition. So as it is, the opportunities are galore. It is only upon farmers to actually stand up and approach us, and they'll reap a lot of rewards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Joseph Karoo. And for more information on this topic, you can visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. From me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #Team Food for Mzansi, thank you for listening.